Fourth section assignment by Raven Charles, History 1378. Throughout history, there has always been groups of individuals fighting various fights for different outcomes. Today, I will be comparing and contrasting three different movements and discussing which movement was the most successful. I will first start with the African American movement. I have placed emphasis and specifically stated African American because there were more civil rights movements that involved other ethnic groups. For example, the Mexican American Civil Rights Movement. When we think of the African American Civil Rights Movement, the name Martin Luther King Jr. is thought about almost immediately. While he did play a huge role as pretty much being the face and a well-known activist, there were other events that took place that eventually led up to the movement. In the early 20th century, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People were able to have corporations desegregate, though it was difficult to implement the law. With the Army still being segregated, African Americans demanded the enforcement of these laws. To mask their frustration, African Americans used spirituals and gospel music to help aid their participation and inspiration in the civil rights movement of the 1960s. Songs like This Little Light of Mine and Nobody Knows the Trouble I've Seen were used to raise money for various fundraisers for the movement that featured Martin Luther King. The African American Civil Rights Movement had ultimately seen success because of Martin Luther King Jr.'s yearn for the treatment of blacks to be the same as whites. He had many famous writings. Two of the most famous ones were his I Have a Dream speech and his A Letter from a Birmingham Jail speech. In both his speech and letter, King emphasized the need for equality, and he created a movement that fought for it by using peaceful protests. Through his movement, he also illustrated that African Americans can be civilized through their peaceful and nonviolent protests. King exemplified his role and urged many to not use violence as a part of protesting. African Americans fought for equality and wanted desegregation to happen. After the Jim Crow laws were removed, the integration of schools was one of the greatest achievements that came out of the African American Civil Rights Movement. Black Americans went from not being wanted to being able to exercise their right to attend school. The African American Civil Rights Movement can be seen as being successful. The next movement I will be discussing is the LGBTQ movement. The LGBTQ movement paralleled with many other movements throughout history, but it really got its start when 23-year-old Henry Gerber founded the Society for Human Rights in the 1920s. Gerber was in the Army for 3 years, and while away in Germany, observed a civil rights movement for homosexuals. It was at this time that Gerber began the same movement in America in his hometown of Chicago. Very few people wanted to become activists, even though there was a number of gay communities in surrounding cities because of the fear of the authorities. After a year of searching, Gerber located 6 men that would help him start his movement. After the project had become well known, Gerber and those 6 men were raided by police, where they took all of their workings and jailed them for 3 days. No charges were filed, but because of this, Gerber lost his job and the society split, and very little was known about the first LGBTQ movement. Another LGBTQ movement was called the Daughters of Bilitis, or DOB, or just simply Daughters. It was a grassroots organization that formed in 1955 in San Francisco, with its last chapter in 1995. Like the name suggests, the organization was the first lesbian civil and political rights movement in the United States. This movement was put in place as an alternative to lesbian bars that often were the subject of harassment and police raids, and also aided with helping women who were afraid to come out. The Daughters had a newspaper publication called The Ladder during their tenure, and it was, and I quote, the glue that kept us together. Whatever other differences there were, and there were many among us, getting the magazine out gave us a reason for working together that was bigger than ourselves, end quote. The latter had 3 segments in which each highlighted the development and growth of the magazine, as well as evolution of 2 movements for gender and sexual freedom. The latter eventually grew into a well-respected publication, not only for homosexuals, but also for heterosexuals and other intelligent and well-read people. It was subtitled A Lesbian Review and became a professionally printed magazine. Its mailing list grew from only being regional to being subscribed from throughout the world, from Canada to Indonesia. Though these 2 LGBTQ movements were not the only movements that occurred in the history of the United States, they were 2 of the most important and most successful movements. The third and final movement that occurred in the United States history was the feminist movement. Feminism ultimately started in the 1960s and 70s and still is relevant today. There were a number of different types of feminists, including African American feminists and lesbian feminists. The American women basically fought for the equal treatment in life, but more specifically, in the workplace. Feminists ultimately wanted the same social standards for women in legislation. The feminist subgroup that I will be putting more emphasis on in this discussion will be the African American feminist group. While the African American civil rights movement fought for black Americans against their white counterparts, the African American feminist movement was solely for black women wanting equality from all people. In one of the primary documents on feminism, author Frances Beale writes about how it is a double jeopardy being a woman and also being black. She says, and I quote, "In attempting to analyze the situation of the black woman in America, one crashes abruptly into a solid wall of grave misconceptions, outright distortions of fact, and defensive attitudes on the part of many. The system of capitalism and its afterbirth, racism, under which we all live, has attempted by many devious ways and means to destroy the humanity of all people, and particularly the humanity of black people. This has meant an outrageous assault on every black man, woman, and child who reside in the United States." End quote. She goes on to say that black women do not understand the true nature of the forces working upon them. They, quote, "tend to accept the capitalist evaluation of manhood and womanhood and believed, in fact, that black men were shiftless and lazy, otherwise they would get a job and support their families as they ought to." End quote. She goes on to discuss the wage scale for different groups in America, and of course, black women make the lowest wages. Women, but especially black women, fought for equality and had goals that included not becoming subservient to men. Of all the movements that have occurred throughout the U.S. history, I think that the most successful movement thus far has been the African American Civil Rights Movement and the LGBTQ movement. Though not perfect and both can improve, these 2 movements have been the most successful thus far. Thank you.